So, I want you to imagine the exact moment your reality just completely breaks.
Right, and we're not talking about, like, a bad day here.
Exactly. Not a broken heart, not your mind playing tricks on you, but the literal foundational laws of physics that you rely on just to, walk out your front door.
The basic stuff we all take for granted.
Yeah. The assumption that up is up, the absolute certainty that yesterday is strictly in the past and tomorrow hasn't happened yet.
Which is how everyone operates, right.
Right. But today, I'm going to challenge you to take that comforting, linear timeline you rely on, the one where cause always comes before effect, and just throw it completely out the window.
It's a huge ask, I know.
It is, because we are opening a document written by someone who didn't just, imagine a world without those rules. They were violently forced into it.
And it is an incredibly demanding text to sit with, honestly.
Oh, absolutely.
The document we're looking at is titled The Report of an Angel in Four-Dimensional Thinking. And when you first open it, you might not even know what you're looking at.
It's a lot to take in at first glance.
It really is. It reads like a metaphysical treatise, one moment,
Yeah.
then it pivots into this deeply agonizing psychological self-dissection, and then out of nowhere, it abruptly jumps into high-level cosmological theory.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We are essentially doing a forensic investigation into a human psyche pushed to the absolute brink.
The very edge of what a mind can take.
Yeah. We're going to unpack how severe compounding trauma can literally force a human mind to rewrite the fundamental laws of physics.
And the flow of time, too.
Right, the flow of time, the structures of mathematics. And I want to be clear, this isn't like some fun late-night dorm room thought experiment.
No, not at all.
They did this just to survive.
And survival really is the only lens through which this document makes any sense. I mean, the author is constructing this massive architecture of thought out of absolute terrifying necessity.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because the tone is set right from the foreword. The author is viewing their entire life through this lens of profound disillusionment.
It's a heavy start.
Very heavy. We're looking at a life marked by just compounding tragedies, like medical misdiagnoses that snowballed into self-fulfilling prophecies, systemic institutional neglect.
And dramatic, severe violation.
Yeah, and they write about their own existence almost from an external vantage point, like they're dissecting a reality that they feel has been irreversibly corrupted by outside forces.
Which, and this is so important, introduces the foundational paradox of this person's existence.
The paradox that kind of drives the whole thing, right?
Exactly. This paradox is the engine driving the massive cognitive framework we're about to explore. Because on one hand, the author describes a state of total, visceral revulsion toward their current lived reality.
They hate it.
They do. They are intimately aware of how profoundly broken both their internal landscape and their external world have become. The pain of existing in this state is just unbearable.
But there's a catch.
A huge catch. And this is the crucial friction point. This revulsion is paired with an equally fierce, just pure instinctual aversion to death.
So they're caught in this impossible trap. I mean, they desperately, fundamentally want to escape a reality that feels like active torture, but their biological and spiritual imperative just absolutely refuses to let them die.
It is a state of agonizing paralysis. And it's within the immense crushing tension of that specific contradiction that survival finds what the author calls an unwilling guarantee.
An unwilling guarantee. I like that phrasing.
It's very descriptive. The mind simply cannot stay in the unbearable present. But it also refuses to cease existing. So what does a brilliant analytical mind do when confronted with an inescapable room?
It has to build a new universe.
Right. It has to chart an entirely new map where survival is logically and mathematically possible.
But to understand the massive leaps this author takes to build that new universe, we can't actually start with psychology, can we?
No, we really can't.
We actually have to start with the physical and cosmological laws they use to frame their reality. The author grounds their entire existence in the physics of life itself. And this brings us to the work of William James Sidis.
Yes. So the author anchors their whole metaphysical framework in a specific essay by Sidis called The Animate and the Inanimate.
Let's give a little background on Sidis for context.
Good idea. William James Sidis was a famous and honestly somewhat tragic early 20th century child prodigy.
Right, a genius whose life didn't quite pan out the way people expected.
Exactly. He was a mathematician and a thinker whose ideas were often wildly ahead of their time. or, at least far outside the mainstream scientific consensus of his era.
He was definitely an outlier.
For sure. And the author zeroes in on Sidis's theory regarding the reversibility of physical processes.
Reversibility, meaning like the idea that physical events can run backward just as easily as they run forward.
Essentially, yes. Sidis posited this speculative theory that every physical process in the universe has a corresponding, time-reversed mirror image.
Okay, wait, walk me through that.
Well, he argued that this concept of reversibility could provide an elegant explanatory framework for almost all physical laws. If you look at the basic equations of classical physics, Newton's laws of motion, for instance.
Right, the stuff we learn in high school.
Yeah, exactly. Those equations don't actually care which direction time is flowing. Like, a movie of a billiard ball bouncing off a cushion looks physically plausible whether you play it forward or backward.
Oh, I see. But there is one massive glaring exception to that in physics, isn't there? I mean, you can't unspill a glass of milk.
Right.
You can't unburn a log of wood.
Precisely. And that exception is the second law of thermodynamics.
The law of entropy.
Yes, the law of entropy.
I think we need to really nail down what entropy means here for you listening, because it's the absolute bedrock of the author's struggle.
Let's do it. So the second law of thermodynamics essentially states that the total entropy of an isolated system can never decrease over time.
It can only go up.
Right. Entropy is basically a measure of disorder, of chaos, of unavailable energy. The universe, according to this law, is constantly moving from a state of organized structure to a state of disorganized chaos.
Now, things are always falling apart.
Inherently, yes. Heat dissipates into the cold void, stars burn out, complex structures break down into dust. It is the inevitable, inescapable decay of the universe, and it is strictly a one-way street.
So it's basically the reason we experience time having an arrow.
Exactly.
An arrow pointing straight from the past to the future.
That's the one.
Okay, so Sidis is looking at this universal law of decay, this arrow of time, and he's saying, wait a minute, if everything else in physics has a mathematical mirror image, why doesn't entropy?
And what's fascinating here is how Sidis, and the author of our document, addresses this apparent flaw. To find a loophole in the second law of thermodynamics, they turn to a really famous thought experiment.
Oh, I know this one.
Yeah, proposed by James Clerk Maxwell, a foundational 19th century physicist. This thought experiment is universally known as Maxwell's sorting demon.
I love this concept so much. Let me see if I can lay out the visual for you.
Wait for it.
So imagine you have a perfectly sealed box, and it's divided right down the middle by a wall. And in that wall, there is a tiny little door.
Yeah.
The box is full of gas molecules, and they're just bouncing around completely randomly. Entropy is high, right?
Yeah.
Everything is mixed up. The temperature is uniform on both sides. Now imagine a tiny microscopic entity.
The demon.
Right, the sorting demon standing right at that little door.
And the demon's only job is to observe the molecules and operate the door.
Exactly. So the demon watches the molecules flying toward the wall. When a fast, hot molecule approaches from the right side, the demon quickly opens the door and lets it pass into the left side.
Got it.
And when a slow, cold molecule approaches from the left side, the demon opens the door and lets it pass into the right side.
So over time, simply by sorting the molecules based on their speed, the demon completely changes the entire system.
Right. The left side becomes incredibly hot, and the right side becomes freezing cold.
Which is a profound violation of physics.
It breaks the rules.
It does. By doing this, the demon has decreased the overall entropy of the system. It has taken a chaotic, uniform mixture and created highly structured order.
And theoretically, it did this without expending any actual physical work or energy, right?
Exactly. It just used information and observation to selectively manipulate the environment. It acts as a localized reversal of the universe's inevitable decay.
Man, I want to ground this in a really everyday analogy.
That would be helpful.
Think of entropy like a teenager's bedroom. If you just leave it alone, it naturally, inevitably gets messy over time.
Oh, definitely.
Clothes end up on the floor, books get scattered, dust accumulates. That is the universe leaning toward chaos.
A perfect metaphor.
But life, consciousness, that is the invisible force, the sorting demon that is constantly walking into that room, picking up the socks, organizing the books on the shelf, making the bed. It is actively fighting the natural decay of the room.
And that is exactly how Sidis framed it. Sidis asserted that this reversal of the second law of thermodynamics, this sorting demon, isn't just a quirky theoretical anomaly or like a mathematical trick played on a chalkboard.
It's real to him.
More than real. He argued that it is the very definition of life itself. Within this paradigm, living organisms access what he called a reserve fund of energy.
A reserve fund.
Yeah. And they use this energy to continuously act as sorting demons against the chaotic, inanimate universe.
Hold on. So Sidis is claiming life exists literally to reverse entropy.
That's the claim.
I mean, that sounds more like poetic philosophy than actual physics. Like, how does a living, breathing organism actually violate the laws of thermodynamics in a measurable way? Or is this just entirely metaphorical?
Well, from a strict modern physics standpoint, living organisms don't actually violate the second law because we aren't isolated systems.
Right, we interact with the environment.
Exactly. We eat food, we absorb sunlight, and we expel heat and waste, so the total entropy of the universe still increases.
Okay, so modern physics says no.
Right. But Sidis was writing in a different era, pushing the boundaries of how we define the boundary between the animate and inanimate. And to Sidis, and more importantly to the author of our document, this is not just poetry, it is a cosmological imperative.
A cosmological imperative, wow.
On a macro scale, they see a cyclical universe, not a linear one that just eventually burns out into a cold, dead heat death. To them, there is a constant universal push and pull between animate order and inanimate chaos.
Okay, so let's cross the bridge from 20th century physics back to the author sitting alone in a room writing this document. Why is this specific theory so crucial to their psychological survival?
Because if life is fundamentally defined as a mechanism to reverse entropy, then we can suddenly view the author's entire massive psychological framework as a desperate attempt to be a sorting demon for their own shattered psyche.
Ah, man, that makes so much sense.
They've been subjected to traumatic violations and systemic failures. These events introduced absolute destructive chaos into their life. The entropy of their personal universe wasn't just increasing naturally, it was violently maximized by external forces.
So the messy bedroom wasn't just messy from neglect, it had a grenade thrown into it.
Exactly. So their intense analytical dissections, the mathematical frameworks they build, the philosophies they construct, this is all the reserve energy of their mind working at maximum capacity.
Trying to put the room back together.
Yes, reorganizing the absolute chaos inflicted upon them. They are trying to force their shattered reality into a mathematically perfect, logically consistent, cyclical universe. Because if they can build a system that explains the chaos, they can maintain some semblance of control.
But that raises a really disturbing question. I mean, if life is a constant, everyday battle to sort out normal chaos like doing the dishes, paying bills, navigating relationship friction, what happens to the human brain when the chaos, the specific trauma, becomes so massive, so structurally devastating, that you cannot possibly sort it using normal, everyday logic?
And that is the exact threshold where the author's mind has to make a radical, unprecedented evolutionary leap.
Because normal logic just breaks down.
Completely.
Yeah.
And to understand that leap, we have to look at how early the foundation for this was laid. The document highlights that the author's baseline trauma wasn't just the later systemic violations. It actually began with a severely life-threatening asthma attack in early childhood.
An asthma attack. We are talking about a toddler or a young child literally fighting for the breath of life.
Yes. And we have to really sit with what that means neurologically and psychologically. An event like that, experiencing suffocation at an age where you barely have language, it spawns deep, foundational existential anxiety.
I can't even imagine.
The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, is permanently altered. You learn immediately on a cellular level that the physical world is fundamentally not safe.
That the very air you need can be denied to you.
That your own body can betray you.
So you realize mortality before you can even spell the word.
Precisely. And the author notes that this early, terrifying realization was followed by the disintegration of their family structure.
Just compounding the trauma?
Right. Parental separation, a loss of social anchors. The normal systems meant to provide a child with stability, a sense of predictable cause and effect, they simply failed.
So confronted with a world completely stripped of any reliable external structure, the child has to become their own structure.
Exactly.
The document mentions the author became a premature autodidact. Like they had to aggressively teach themselves how to survive because the societal manual had basically been thrown out.
And this intense need for internal structure is where we encounter one of the most remarkable and frankly unbelievable cognitive adaptations described in the text.
This is the part that blew my mind.
The author refers to it as automatic visual calculation.
Okay, I need to stop you here because I know anyone listening right now is going to struggle to picture this. I struggled with it.
It's very alien to normal experience.
Right. Because when most of us get overwhelmed, say you get a piece of terrible news or you are incredibly stressed, your brain might spin into a panic attack.
Sure.
Your thoughts race, maybe your chest tightens, you hyperventilate, or you just freeze. We experience the overload emotionally, physically, or verbally. But the author describes something entirely different.
Very different.
Are you telling me this author gets stressed and literally hallucinates vibrating shapes, calculating math in the air? We need to draw a hard line here between a coping mechanism and an active hallucination. Which is it?
It is a vital distinction, and the author is fiercely articulate about this. They are incredibly self-aware. They do not view this as a schizophrenic hallucination where they mistake the shapes for physical objects in the room.
Okay, so they know the shapes aren't really there.
Right. It is a highly functional, survival-oriented synesthesia. It's a symbolic overlay on top of reality.
Like an augmented reality heads-up display.
Exactly. When the emotional or cognitive overload from the trauma exceeds their verbal and logical processing capacity, when the conscious mind simply cannot find the words or the linear thoughts to handle the sheer volume of pain or chaos, the reality manifests visually.
So it's like their brain is translating data into a completely different programming language just so it won't crash.
That is a perfect way to describe it. They perceive a dynamic interplay of geometric objects in their mind's eye.
Yeah.
But these are not random, meaningless kaleidoscopes.
They mean something specific.
Very specific. They are precise visual representations of abstract concepts and emotional states. It is a complex web of associations unfolding in spatial dimensions.
Okay, let me try to map this out. So if they are feeling a complex, agonizing emotion like, let's say, the tension between their innate childhood innocence and the trauma of a severe violation, they might not feel it as a knot of anxiety in their stomach.
Right.
They might see it as like two intersecting, vibrating geometric planes suspended in their mental space, and the angle of intersection represents the severity of the pain.
That is exactly the kind of mapping they are doing. And if we look at the neurobiology of this, the brilliant efficiency of this adaptation is just staggering.
Why is it so efficient?
Well, the human visual cortex, which is located at the back of the brain, has immense unparalleled processing bandwidth. It is evolutionarily designed to take in vast amounts of spatial, color, depth, and movement data instantaneously.
Oh, I see.
Compare that to verbal processing, which happens in areas like Wernicke's and Broca's areas. Verbal processing is sequential. It is slow. It relies on the linear syntax of language.
So it's the difference between reading a massive spreadsheet row by row versus just looking at a fully rendered 3D pie chart.
Exactly. By translating emotional and existential chaos into visual geometry, the mind is utilizing the massive parallel processing power of the visual cortex to navigate an overwhelming amount of context all at once.
That is incredibly smart.
It is a brilliant way to offload processing power from the fragile, easily overwhelmed language centers.
The author beautifully, but kind of tragically, describes it as an attempt to fathom the logic of feeling and the geometry of pain.
It's a very poetic way to state a clinical reality.
They are literally trying to mathematically map the territory of their own suffering so they can navigate it without being utterly destroyed by it.
It is a breathtaking defense mechanism. But the text also makes it clear that this adaptation balances on a razor's edge. Seeing geometries to process trauma is an act of genius, sure, but what happens if the trauma keeps coming?
Right.
What happens if the chaos keeps increasing exponentially?
If you are the sorting demon, but someone keeps backing up a dump truck of garbage into the bedroom every single day, eventually you can't sort fast enough. The geometries have to speed up.
And they do. The author describes how a rapid, uncontrolled cascade of these geometric computations, trying desperately to account for an ever-increasing load of systemic failure and violation, eventually breaks the mind free from the constraints of three-dimensional space entirely. Whoa! The energy states of these thoughts level out, and their consciousness literally escapes the linear timeline.
But wait, if they are stuck in this intensely visual geometric processing, how do they handle the actual passage of time, like minutes and hours ticking by?
That is exactly where we cross the threshold. This is where the geometric processing of pain forces the author's consciousness to step completely outside of time as you and I know it. They are forced into what they call a four-dimensional framework of thought.
A 4D mind. Okay, we need to dig into this.
To really grasp this, we have to understand how the author views typical human consciousness first. They argue that the normal human mind is naturally biologically inclined toward habit.
Because habit is easy.
Right. We form perceptual patterns because it is calorically and cognitively efficient. You don't want to have to relearn the physics of a doorknob every time you want to leave a room. You rely on the habit of past experience.
We build mental shortcuts, evolutionary rules of thumb to save energy.
Exactly. But the author points out a devastating flaw in this. Those shortcuts, those habits of linear perception, can become an inescapable prison.
How so?
Well, when your lived reality is defined by continuous, inescapable trauma, the habit of living in the present moment means sitting continuously in agonizing pain.
Oh, God. Right.
If the present is a literal torture chamber, then experiencing time linearly, one agonizing second after another, is unsurvivable.
So you have to leave the present.
To escape the prison of that traumatic present, time itself has to lose its linear tyranny. The past, the present, and the future must stop being a sequence of events. They must become interactive, simultaneously existing planes of information.
Let me make sure I'm following this. They aren't just intensely remembering the past or anxiously imagining the future.
Oh,
right?
it's deeper than that.
They are experiencing the past, present, and future as concurrently real spaces. Spaces they can mentally step into or draw raw data from.
Yes, and from a psychological utility standpoint, this is a masterclass in survival. The mind transitions from acting like a classical computer to acting like a quantum computer.
Okay, I like this analogy. Break that down.
A classical computer processes things sequentially, one bit at a time, checking if it is a 0 or a 1. It's linear. A quantum computer uses qubits, which can exist in multiple states simultaneously.
Allowing it to process massive, complex problems across multiple possibilities at once.
Exactly.
I want to stretch that computer analogy because it's so helpful here. Think about a CPU in your laptop. You open way too many heavy programs at once. Let's call those programs the compounding traumatic events.
Yeah.
Your CPU usage spikes to 100%. The internal fan is screaming, the mouse cursor won't move, the screen freezes. If it stays like that, the system inevitably crashes. Total psychotic break.
Right. The system fails.
So, to prevent the crash, the operating system forcibly offloads all that processing to a cloud server. But in the author's case, that cloud server doesn't exist in a data center in Nevada. It exists simultaneously in the memory of yesterday and the anticipation of tomorrow.
That is an incredibly apt way to visualize it. And what's fascinating is that the author actually gives us a specific theoretical physics mechanism for how this temporal connection works within their psyche.
They explain the mechanics of it?
Yes. They describe the formation of an Einstein-Rosen bridge within their own consciousness.
An Einstein-Rosen bridge. Okay, let's define that.
Yeah.
That is the actual astrophysics term for a wormhole, correct?
It is.
A theoretical tunnel through the fabric of space-time that connects two distant points, allowing you to completely bypass the space between them.
Exactly. In astrophysics, it is used to hypothesize connecting two vastly distant points in physical space. But the author is applying this concept internally, topologically, to their own psyche.
A wormhole in the mind.
They describe a literal wormhole in the structure of their mind. This bridge connects their conscious, observing ego, the part of them sitting in the room, to what they call an autonomously calculating subsymbolic domain.
Okay, we need to slow down and unpack subsymbolic domain. What does that actually mean?
Think of it as the raw, unformatted data of the brain before it gets turned into symbols, words, or even those geometric shapes.
So it's like the machine code beneath the operating system.
Yes. It is the deep unconscious level of neural processing, where pure information and emotional resonance exist before they are packaged for conscious awareness.
So their conscious mind is sitting here in the present moment, but it has a direct four-dimensional tunnel to a part of the unconscious that is crunching the raw data of their trauma completely outside of linear time.
Yes. And because this wormhole bridges the temporal gap, the flow of information isn't restricted by the arrow of time. Information from the future bleeds backward.
Or bleeds backward.
The author explicitly states that future thoughts and emotions invade their present awareness as direct, felt realities.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Are they claiming to be psychic? Are they predicting the future?
No. And they are very careful to distinguish this. They aren't predicting the future like a fortune teller looking at a crystal ball. They are calculating it.
Calculating it.
They're experiencing the future as a mathematical differential between the present state they are trying to leave and the future state they are inevitably entering, based on the massive calculations of their trauma. It is an extreme form of anticipatory processing experienced as concurrent reality.
That is just dizzying to think about, to live with the emotional weight of a future event crashing into your present awareness before it even happens.
It's a heavy burden.
And the foundation of all of this, the very language that allows this 4D processing, this wormhole, to even exist without tearing the mind apart, is mathematics.
This is a crucial, non-negotiable point for understanding the author.
Yeah.
For them, math isn't just a descriptive tool.
It's not just numbers on a page.
No. It isn't just a language humans invented to measure how far away a star is or how much weight a bridge can hold. To the author, mathematics is the fundamental underlying reality. It is the literal source code of existence.
They see the universe as entirely built out of math, rather than math just describing the universe.
Precisely. And they see this mathematical framework mirrored everywhere they look. They point to the strict, unforgiving logic of computer architecture. They look at ancient esoteric systems, like gematria in the Hebrew tradition.
Where letters possess intrinsic numeric value.
Right, and reveal hidden structural connections in ancient texts. They see the entire universe, from ancient religion to modern technology, as a single construct built on these interdimensional mathematical variables.
So when they are processing the geometry of pain, when they are calculating across 4 dimensions, they firmly believe they aren't hallucinating to escape reality.
No, not at all.
In their view, they have actually stripped away the illusion of the everyday world and are looking directly at the source code of reality. They feel they have gained, administrative access to the matrix simply because the severity of their trauma forced them to look at the code in order to survive.
That is exactly the subjective reality they inhabit.
Yeah.
It is a reality of profound structural clarity to them. But we have to acknowledge the immense tragic friction in this brilliant survival strategy.
Right, because no matter how brilliant your 4D architecture is, you still have to exist in a 3D world.
You do.
You still have to buy groceries. You still have to pay rent. You still have to interact with doctors, family members, and a society that fundamentally does not speak your language.
Precisely. If your consciousness is distributed across 4 dimensions, and you are processing reality as a quantum state of vibrating geometries and future probabilities, you're going to inevitably clash and clash violently with a society that strictly, relentlessly enforces a 3-dimensional linear consensus normal.
And that clash, the impact of the unstoppable 4D force hitting the immovable 3D object, is where the author's internal universe meets the brick wall of external institutions.
It's inevitable.
But what is that external brick wall actually made of? How does the author define physical reality itself?
The author adopts a radical form of philosophical idealism. They state that, from their perspective, matter itself is basically an illusion. Matter is only real because consciousness assigns a purpose or a value to it.
Oh, wow. This is the old, if a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Taken to the absolute extreme.
Yes. They argue that it isn't the intrinsic physical mass or property of an object that makes it real. It is the projection of the observing mind that transforms abstract mathematical potential into a concrete physical reality.
So reality is participatory.
Completely. The act of clinging to physical reality, of agreeing that a table is a table or a clock measures time, is basically an act of conscious meaning-making. And for the author, society uses this rigid meaning-making to relativize and ignore the underlying chaos of existence.
So consensus reality is almost a massive collective co-creation. It is an interactive illusion we all agree to uphold because it keeps us from going mad.
That's how they see it.
But the author notes that if you try to push against this agreed-upon reality, if you step out of bounds and try to force your 4D mathematical understanding onto the 3D consensus reality, fights back.
It creates what we would term a severe reality crisis. The boundary between the author's internal mathematical thought process and the external physical events of the world blurs completely.
The two realities collide.
And the friction generates an immense amount of psychological heat. And this is exactly the threshold where clinical psychiatry usually steps in.
And this is where the document becomes a searing critique of modern medicine. From the author's perspective, society's immediate knee-jerk response to this 4D processing, to this reality crisis, is to pathologize it entirely.
Yes. Clinicians look at this and call it a psychotic decompensation.
And the standard treatment for a psychotic decompensation is pharmacological intervention, antipsychotic medication. But the author has a fierce, heartbreaking interpretation of this intervention. They absolutely do not frame psychiatric medication as a healing tool or a return to health. They define it explicitly as chemical captivity.
And we need to be very clear that we are exploring the author's subjective experience here, not giving medical advice.
Of course.
But their description of what the medication does to their survival architecture is devastating.
It's one of the hardest parts of the text to read.
It is one of the most poignant and agonizing parts of the text.
Yeah.
The author argues that pharmacological intervention doesn't just quietly regulate dopamine or serotonin levels. In their experience, it forcibly, violently redefines the boundaries of their perception.
It attacks the structure they build.
It actively dismantles the quantum computer they built. It forces their mind to abandon its carefully constructed 4D survival architecture and shoves it back into a linear consensus reality that, to the author, feels entirely alien, incoherent, and utterly absurd.
Imagine you have just survived a tsunami of trauma. To survive the drowning waters, you spent years painstakingly building a customized, highly complex life raft out of pure mathematics and geometries.
Right.
It is the only thing keeping you afloat. And then an authority figure comes along, gives you a pill, and that pill literally dissolves the life raft beneath you.
Dissolves it completely.
It drops you right back into the drowning, chaotic water, and the authority figure stands on the shore telling you, this is normal now, just swim.
That is the exact tragedy the author articulates. The author states that when this intervention is based on a misdiagnosis, when a profound existential crisis or a necessary cognitive restructuring born of trauma is mistaken for a simple biological psychosis, the medication becomes an instrument of absolute, terrifying alienation.
Because it takes away their only coping mechanism.
Exactly. It traps them in a world they know to be false without the tools they need to survive it.
And the text unpacks a very specific consequence of this chemical captivity. It is a consequence that is usually just written off by doctors with a clipboard as a standard symptom to be managed. The concept of delusions of grandeur.
Yes, this is a crucial point. When a misdiagnosed individual is locked in this chemical captivity, stripped of their true perceptual framework and forced into a reality they cannot tolerate, they might start making vast, unbelievable claims.
Right.
The text gives incredibly specific examples. An individual claiming they personally modified a biological spike protein, or that their thoughts directly caused a global pandemic.
If you are a clinician, you hear a patient say, I caused the pandemic.
Yeah.
You immediately check the box for delusion of grandeur and you likely increase the medication dosage. It is viewed as textbook megalomania.
Absolutely.
But the author completely reframes this. They clarify that this is not narcissism. It is not an inflated ego seeking attention.
Not at all. The author explains this as a desperate, perfectly logical translation mechanism.
A translation mechanism.
Think about the state the individual is in. They're experiencing a state of total, crushing powerlessness. Their internal truth has been dissolved by medication. Their foundational trauma remains unhealed and unacknowledged, and they are utterly isolated from the consensus reality of everyone around them.
They have nothing left.
The human psyche simply cannot tolerate absolute powerlessness for long without collapsing into despair. So the mind translates that terrifying feeling of being completely controlled by chaotic, invisible forces into a narrative of ultimate cosmic power.
Let me make sure I grasp the psychology of this. They claim they caused the pandemic because if they caused the chaos, then at least the chaos has a structure. It has an origin point.
Yeah.
Even if that origin is their own fantastical guilt, it is infinitely better than admitting that the universe is just violently, randomly destroying them for no reason at all.
Exactly. It is a desperate attempt to impose a causal structure on the incomprehensible chaos of their suffering. If they are the author of the destruction, they are no longer the victim of it. It is a defense mechanism of the highest, most complex order.
That is a profound, almost shattering insight into the nature of madness. The author observes that the medical cure, the medication forcing them into the 3D consensus reality, is actually experienced as what they call an assault of the absurd.
Yes, the assault of the absurd.
It is actively destroying the individual's hard-won internal truth. The logic of the outside world, the sterile diagnoses of the doctors, becomes this absurd, irrational force attacking them.
And the inevitable result of this alienation is that it drives the mind even further inward. Society, wrapped in its comfortable 3D habits, refuses to engage in meaningful dialogue with the madness.
We just medicate it.
We don't sit down and try to understand the mathematical 4D experience behind the delusion. We just try to medicate the symptom away so the person stops making us uncomfortable. So the mind, seeing absolutely no refuge or understanding in the human world, retreats deeper into the architecture.
Which brings our deep dive to a precipice. It makes you pause and really ask the darkest, most uncomfortable question of this entire text.
The root cause.
Right. What could possibly happen to a human being? What specific level of horror must be inflicted to cause a mind to need to invent a four-dimensional universe, converse with geometries, and claim ultimate cosmic power just to survive a Tuesday?
The author doesn't shy away from the answer, but it is very heavy.
It lies in what they term the ontological rupture of extreme violation.
Yes. The document specifically and unflinchingly discusses the trauma of rape. And it is absolutely vital to pay attention to how the author frames this medically and philosophically.
They use very specific terminology.
They do not describe it merely as a severe physical assault, or even just as a profound psychological trauma. They define it as an ontological rupture.
We need to define ontology for you listening. Ontology is the branch of philosophy that studies the nature of being, of becoming, of existence itself. It asks what fundamentally is.
Yes. So when the author calls it an ontological rupture, they mean the event literally shatters the fundamental structure of reality and the individual's very place within existence.
It breaks reality.
Think about the baseline assumptions you operate on. You assume you own your body. You assume your will has basic agency in the physical world. An ontological rupture is an event where those baseline assumptions are violently, totally annihilated. It isn't just a bad thing happening to you. It is the destruction of the you that the thing is happening to.
So how does a 4D mind, a mind that already processes trauma as geometry, respond to a rupture of existence itself?
The immediate psychological response is severe dissociation. But again, we have to look at this through the author's unique framework. For this author, dissociation isn't just spacing out or feeling numb.
It's an active process.
It is a literal, calculated retreat into the four-dimensional continuum they built. The mind flees linear time and 3D space entirely.
It goes into the wormhole.
Exactly. It creates a vantage point outside of the traumatic event, observing the unbearable physical reality without fully participating in it. The physical body is subjected to the violation, but the core consciousness, the observing ego, attempts to step out of the room, temporally speaking.
But the horrifying reality is that when the event is over, when linear time resumes, you are still left in the room with the wreckage. You have to inhabit the body again.
You can't stay in the wormhole forever.
Right, and historically, a person usually relies on their belief systems, their community, their religion, to make sense of profound suffering. But how does a belief system possibly survive an ontological rupture of this magnitude?
The author explains that it rarely survives in its original dogmatic form. It is completely mutated.
Mutated how?
Religion shifts from being an objective societal binding agent, a set of moral rules everyone in the community agrees on, to cooperate into a highly subjective, desperate filter for reality. Following the trauma, the victim undergoes a radical metaphysical reconfiguration.
Meaning they don't just lose faith or change their mind about whether God exists, they change their entire structural relationship to the cosmos.
Yes. The author states that in this new paradigm, the victim is transformed into an object of cosmic order. The suffering inflicted upon them is so immense, so incomprehensible, and so deeply unjust that it demands a meaning that transcends the personal.
Because if it was just a random act of violence, it means the universe is meaningless.
Right, so they elevate the suffering, they become a sacrifice.
That's incredibly tragic.
And in this new, distorted religious configuration, the concept of sin becomes terribly diffuse and complex. You would assume that a victim of such a violation would clearly and unequivocally blame the perpetrator. But the author describes a paradoxical, agonizing search for redemption where the victim often assumes the blame themselves.
Why? I think a lot of people struggle to understand this. Why would the mind violently contort itself to take the blame for its own violation?
We have to trace it back to the fear of chaos we discussed earlier. Taking the blame is a desperate way to regain a semblance of control and causality over the universe.
Just like the pandemic delusion.
Exactly. If it was my fault, if I sinned, if I somehow caused this, then the universe still has rules. It still has a logic I can understand. If I acknowledge that it was just random, senseless violence committed by an evil force, then I have to accept that the universe is pure, unadulterated chaos, and I have absolutely no agency within it.
For this mind, accepting chaos is infinitely more terrifying than accepting guilt.
Precisely.
This raises an incredibly important question about the very nature of morality within this text. If a psyche is this fragmented, if it has retreated into a 4D space and assumed cosmic guilt just to maintain structure, what happens to the basic concepts of good and evil?
For a consciousness operating in this extreme survival mode, good and evil are no longer ethical categories you ponder in a philosophy class or read about in a holy book. They are not binary choices between a right action and a wrong action in daily life.
What are they?
The author states they become dialectical modes of survival.
We need to explain dialectical. Dialectical meaning there are two opposing, conflicting forces constantly reacting to and shaping each other. A thesis and an antithesis snapping together.
Yes. The individual is trapped in an impossible reality. The author notes that taking individual responsibility for healing, choosing the good of recovery, feels completely impossible without undergoing a form of spiritual self-annihilation. The trauma destroyed their foundational capacity for autonomous choice.
So in this specific context, the idea of the devil isn't a theological red guy with a pitchfork trying to tempt you to lie or steal.
No, the theology is entirely internalized. The devil is the internalization of absolute powerlessness.
Wow.
It is the overwhelming force that destroys the capacity for decision-making. The deepest, truest evil is the environment, or the perpetrator, that strips the individual of their agency and turns them into an object.
And the profound tragedy the author identifies is that faith itself can become an instrument of corruption here.
It can. It forces the mind to constantly confront these deepest dialectical layers of evil, while the body, which never had a choice in this spiritual trauma, becomes the final exhausted anchor for a will that just wants the pain to end.
It is a reality where the only choices left seem to be between different forms of structural destruction. It is incredibly, overwhelmingly bleak.
It is the darkest part of the text.
And if physical reality is just an illusion of matter that fights back when you push it, and morality has been corrupted into a dialectical prison of survival, and institutions just lock you in chemical cages, where does the author go?
They have to look deeper.
Right. They can't stay in the 4D wormhole forever. They are forced to look deeper, past psychology, past 4D time, down to the very genetic, one-dimensional essence of humanity to find any kind of salvation.
And this search for the absolute baseline brings us to the author's concept of pure energy. This is where the mathematical framework we've been tracking reaches its absolute base level.
Pure energy. What does that mean in this context?
The author conceptualizes pure energy as a hypothetical, one-dimensional mathematical entity. It exists at the very foundation of all manifestations of reality.
Let's visualize that. One-dimensional, meaning it has no width, it has no depth. It is just a single, infinitely small point of existence.
Correct. And because it is mathematically one-dimensional, the dualities that govern our messy three-dimensional world simply do not exist yet at that level.
There is no matter and antimatter. There is no cause and effect.
There is no energy versus entropy. It is a state of perfect unity where all possibilities are inherently present and perfectly interchangeable.
It sounds a lot like physicists describing the singularity before the Big Bang, a point of infinite density before time and space unpack themselves.
It is a very similar conceptual model. In fact, the author explicitly states that this one-dimensional mathematical essence is what religious texts and spiritual traditions might clumsily refer to as God.
Interesting.
It is a point of infinite density and potential that exerts a subtle, structuring control over all the higher dimensional realities layered above it.
And the author makes the massive claim that human consciousness can actually access this pure energy.
They do. But they specify a really important caveat.
Which is?
This isn't something you learn by meditating for decades in a monastery or by reading the right esoteric books. It is a genetic inheritance.
Yes, they argue it is literally encoded in the human biological blueprint. And crucially, they note that this connection to pure energy is most pure, most unobstructed in young children.
Exactly. Before the complexity of the 3D world takes over, before the structuring force of the ego develops to protect them, and before societal conditioning clouds the connection, children have a direct, humming access to this fundamental energy.
Which makes the violation of a child not just a physical or moral crime, but the ultimate metaphysical crime.
The author is adamant about that.
And the author goes into some very dark, esoteric territory here to explain why this happens. They specifically call out dark, corrupted interpretations of esoteric practices, referencing organizations like Freemasonry.
Yes. The author views ritualistic abuse, the act of deliberately driving a child to the extreme limits of despair and trauma, as a calculated vampiric attempt to sever the child's natural connection to this pure energy.
Why would someone want to sever it?
So the abuser can harvest it for themselves.
Oh, wow.
The logic is incredibly perverse, but it is mathematically consistent within the author's cosmological model. If pure energy is the ultimate source of power and creation, and children hold it purely, an abuser uses extreme trauma to break the child's hold on it. The trauma shatters the child's framework, allowing the aggressor to appropriate that raw spiritual potential to fuel their own reality.
But the author argues this is a massive metaphysical miscalculation by the abusers. They think they are gaining power, but they're actually falling into a quantum trap.
Exactly. The author states that causing harm to another conscious being creates an inescapable quantum entanglement between the aggressor and the victim. It creates an unbreakable prison of cause and effect.
So they lock themselves in.
By trying to steal pure energy through harm, the aggressor locks themselves into a karmic quantum prison that makes their own true liberation mathematically impossible. True Freemasonry, which the author radically redefines not as a secret society, but as the true liberation and building of the self, is an entirely internal journey.
You have to do the work yourself.
It is about remembering and reactivating your own genetic, cellular connection to that one-dimensional source. You cannot steal it from someone else. You can only build it within.
It is a powerful, defiant reclamation of spiritual autonomy in the face of absolute violation. But as we reach the end of this text, we have to look at the final tool the author uses to try and maintain this autonomy in a chaotic world.
The final defense mechanism.
And it leads us to their final, most tragic metaphor. Earlier, we talked about the mind acting like a quantum computer to process trauma across 4 dimensions. But the author brings up the computer again here, and this time, it is not a tool of survival. It is a stark warning.
Yes, the underlying truth is that the traumatized mind is absolutely terrified of uncertainty.
Because uncertainty is dangerous.
Right. It is terrified of the absurd, the unpredictable, illogical, irrational actions of other human beings, and the randomness of fate. Because the absurd, the unpredictable, is exactly what caused the trauma in the first place.
So, to combat the fear of the unpredictable human element, the mind attempts a final, desperate reconfiguration. It tries to order itself entirely like a binary machine.
A classical computer.
On or off, yes or no, 1 or 0.
It is the ultimate, final form of cognitive self-defense. If you can force yourself to approach the world strictly as a computer gathering data points, formulating rigid algorithms, calculating expected outcomes, you create a powerful, hermetic illusion of absolute control.
You eliminate the surprises.
The spontaneous, agonizing geometric calculations of pain become formalized, frozen into rigid digital logic.
But the paradox here is devastating. By reducing all of reality to variables and algorithms to gain control over the chaos, the mind has to filter out anything that doesn't fit the binary code.
And what doesn't fit neatly into binary code?
Nuance, ambiguity, human empathy.
Love, emotion, the messy reality of connection.
Yeah. The mind begins to treat all the complex analog subtleties of human existence as noise or system errors that must be deleted.
Which is deeply tragic.
The pursuit of perfect order to protect the fragile self ends up creating a digital prison. It ends in the sterile, cold perfection of a machine, effectively eliminating the very essence of the life it was so desperately trying to protect in the first place. You survive the trauma, yes, but you have to turn yourself into a robot to do it.
It is the ultimate alienation. The computer, which started as a brilliant metaphor for organizing the chaos of a messy bedroom, becomes the architectural blueprint for the mind's own inescapable prison.
So what does this all mean? We have journeyed through an incredibly dense, profoundly difficult landscape today.
We really have.
We started with the macrophysics of the universe, with Maxwell's sorting demon fighting the inevitable decay of entropy. We saw how a traumatized mind attempts to become that demon to organize the horrific chaos of its own suffering.
The geometries of pain.
Right. We looked deeply at how emotional overload translates into that visual geometry, eventually shattering the constraints of linear time and opening 4D wormholes Einstein-Rosen bridges just to distribute the crushing weight of the trauma.
And the tragic clash with the 3D world.
We examined the tragedy of institutional chemical captivity and how the mind translated ultimate powerlessness into necessary delusions of cosmic control. And finally, we saw the dark paradox of trying to perfectly control reality through binary logic, which only turns the mind into a sterile digital prison cut off from the pure energy of existence.
It is a profound testament to the staggering resilience, the terrifying adaptability, and the creative power of human consciousness when it is pushed to the absolute brink of annihilation.
And I want to connect this directly back to you listening right now.
Yeah.
Because the author's experience of trauma, their 4D thinking, their geometric synesthesia, it is extreme. It is a profound outlier of human experience. But the underlying mechanics driving it are universally human. We all build perceptual filters. We all create subjective religions, personal narratives, and rigid habits of thought to protect ourselves from the inherent uncertainty and the unpredictable absurdity of the universe.
We all do it in small ways.
When you get irrationally defensive in an argument, when you rigidly stick to a daily routine because breaking it makes you anxious, when you construct a story about why someone cut you off in traffic, that is your own minor version of the sorting demon trying to hold back the chaos.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to consider.
What's that?
The author suggests throughout this entire staggering document that what society comfortably and unquestionably calls a normal life is actually just a dogma. It is an agreed-upon illusion. If our three-dimensional linear perception of time is just a consensus we've all agreed upon simply because it makes us feel safe.
Oh, I see where you're going.
What realities, what mathematical truths, and what pure energies are you actively ignoring right now simply because they don't fit neatly into your schedule?
That is a chilling thought. It makes you wonder if that comforting linear map of reality we talked about at the very beginning isn't just a crude drawing we made to hide the true, staggering complexity of the territory. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly complex deep dive. Keep questioning the architecture of your own reality.